Redshift has joined the family. That's big news out there. Also, we're nominated for Product of the Year here at NAB 2019. In addition, we got an Oscar this year for MoGraph. So thank you to all our MoGraph users out there, everybody using MoGraph and our engineers putting that together. So really big year for us, and so many amazing artists in the lineup, one of which I got to meet last year at Half Res. I think we were over at Half Res, and I saw a little bit of his work, and I immediately said, "Will you present?" I didn't even talk to him that long. I said, "Will you present?" And he was like, I was like, "No, trust me. The whole community is going to want to see what you do." So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Aaron, now Covrett. Aaron Covrett.
All right, thank you guys. Thank you so much for being here. Special thanks to Maxon for having me. My name is Aaron Covrett. I am a freelance 3D artist. I've just been working in New York for 2 years, but I'm actually very excited to announce that I'll be moving to Los Angeles this summer. And today I want to talk to you guys about my personal work, how I'm researching new technologies, new pipelines, all in the pursuit of achieving fidelity. Now, I've actually prepared a small reel of some of this work from the past year. I'd like to show you guys that first, give you an idea of what it is that I do, and then we can dive in deeper. All right, I hope you enjoy. Thank you guys so much. So, as you can see, there's a lot of variety in the work that I'm doing. There's everything from simulations and tools like Houdini and RealFlow. There's more traditional prop development where I'm actually modeling inside of Cinema 4D, as well as utilizing these props to then populate much larger scale environments. Now, what I want to talk to you guys specifically about today is my process for prop development inside of Cinema 4D. And in looking at that, we can discuss things like asset optimization, so how to be working with really large, dense, high-poly assets from a third-party source, such as Marvelous Designer. We'll talk about how to optimize this all within Cinema 4D. In a broader sense, also looking at scene management, so how to be working with really large and complicated scene files while keeping your viewport happy. And in my case, I'll actually be using a little bit of Octane Render today. So we can discuss potential obstacles, such as VRAM limitations. And lastly, I also want to walk you through a really exciting case study from a recent project called Harvest. I think this will be an excellent example of how to apply a lot of the principles and techniques that we'll be discussing today, but in a more practical context. Okay, let's get started with asset optimization. So here you can see is a prop that I've built for a much larger scene. It's a New York City garbage can. And it looks like there's a lot of stuff happening here, but really all that I'm doing is using a soft body dynamics simulation inside of Cinema 4D to drop all of the debris that you see here into the bin. Now, I want to draw your attention to this garbage bag asset. This is actually a mesh that I've built inside of Marvelous Designer. And you can see here that the mesh fidelity holds up really well. There's a lot of nice, sharp creases up here, sort of softer secondary forms happening down here. It looks great. But if we take a look at the wireframe, yeah, this is actually the topology of the mesh. You can see just how dense a third-party model could potentially be when you're using third-party tools. And in fact, you can imagine why that'd actually be an issue if we wanted to add dynamics so that it's properly interacting with the other elements in this scene. So what we will discuss today is how to use some of Cinema 4D's native tools like the polygon reduction generator to actually optimize this into a much lighter state. I also want to show you a really cool technique for transferring some of this high poly information that you see onto something like a normals map that we can actually use to maintain consistency across the different versions of our models we'll build. And lastly, I also want to show you a really cool method for building a cage mesh. And what I mean by that is a proxy version we'll use to drive that simulation data. Okay, so before we jump into Cinema, I did mention I built this mesh inside of Marvelous Designer. I don't want to dive too deep into that, but I did record a bit of the process, which I'll show you. And I want to give a shout out to the artist, Marcel Scheike, for sharing his process on how to create garbage bags like this inside of Marvelous Designer. And really all you need to know about Marvelous Designer is that it's an excellent cloth simulation tool. And so there are two environments you're working in. There's this 2D environment on the right where you're building shapes in a layout almost like you would if you were a fashion designer. And then you could actually simulate and apply 3D properties to that here in the left viewport. And really all that I'm doing for this technique is just building the stuffing that I'll actually use to drive the form of the garbage bag mesh. And from here, the really cool thing actually about this process is that when we're finished and we're ready to bring this into Cinema 4D, we can actually export these 2D shapes that you see on the right here as our UV coordinates. And that's great because it means that we don't have to worry about UV unwrapping this asset for more advanced texturing steps. Okay, let's jump ahead and open this up in Cinema. So here I've already got this preloaded in. You can see I'm actually doing this by, there we go, I can see the name now. I'm doing this by just exporting out an OBJ from Marvelous Designer. And I want to point out a few things. So again, the fidelity is holding up really well. There's all these nice creases and wrinkles happening. But again, if I turn on wireframe, you can see just how dense the topology is. And that's going to be a problem if we add dynamics. So what I will show you guys today is how I would go about sort of processing this asset, getting it ready, and then we'll dive into optimization as well as dynamics. So the first thing I want to point out, if I zoom in here really close, as nice as this is looking, you can start to see these sort of jagged edges happening. In fact, if I turn on the wireframe, you can see this becomes much more apparent. And it's not a huge deal, but it almost looks like we should apply a subdivision surface to this. The last thing I want to do is add more mesh information, though. So I can actually just drag in a smoothing deformer. And right away, you'll see we're actually fixing a lot of these issues. If I zoom out quite a bit, you'll see a lot of those issues are gone, but we are losing quite a bit of detail. In fact, let's see, can I stretch this back a little bit? Sorry, the mouse is a little sensitive. Come on. All right. Well, what you can see happening here if I turn this off is that we're actually losing quite a bit of these details, and that's because by default, this deformer comes in at 100% strength. And so if I lower this down to something like 20%, you can see now we're finding a happy sort of compromise where we're cleaning up any of these tiny little issues, but without giving up much of our details. Let's go ahead and bake this down. Oops. Double click both. Now, you guys do not have to be working destructively on this, but in the sake of keeping things running smoothly live, I'm going to be baking down a few things today. And before we optimize this, I want to show you one quick thing. So if we jump into the body paint UV edit mode here, and I have my mesh selected, here you can see these are those 2D shapes that I mentioned inside of Marvelous Designer. And so they are actually coming in as our UV coordinates. That's great. It's going to be really important, though, for some of these next steps that we're not altering what you see here in any way. We want to be protecting exactly what we see. Okay, let's jump back. And let's go ahead and create a low poly version of this. So I'm going to copy this. We'll hide the original. I'm going to name this one low. Oh, I got caps lock enabled, that's why. And I want to hit Shift-C to bring up Cinema 4D's search bar. Let's go ahead and search polygon reduction. And I want to grab this generator. Let's enable preserve UV boundaries. And I want to drag in my low poly mesh. Now, this is actually going to take a little while to process. And while that's happening, I want to explain a few quick things. So I actually grabbed the polygon reduction generator that was introduced in R19. And with that came a few really cool features. So one of which you saw, I enabled preserve UV boundaries. That's doing exactly what we need it to. It's protecting those UV islands that I pointed out. But the other really cool thing here is actually a method called adaptive sampling. And so right now, Cinema 4D is sort of analyzing this mesh, and it's looking for areas that are really detailed. And in an effort to preserve the quality there, we're actually going to leave more polygons distributed in these areas. Now, we can do this while still optimizing the mesh overall, because it's also finding areas that are flatter, maybe have less detail, and we're going to significantly pull back on the distribution here. I'll show you exactly what I mean when this is finished. All right, looks like we're done. If I turn on the wireframe, already you can see quite a significant difference in our mesh topology. In fact, if I click on the generator, you can see we're actually looking at a 90% reduction strength. And the really cool thing about this tool is that that large processing only has to happen once. And so we can come in here, let's change this number. We'll even lower it to something like 40%. And you'll see Cinema's actually able to update this much more quickly in the viewport. It still does take a little bit of time because it's adding all of that polygons back, but now you're seeing a few different things happen. So we're actually weakening the strength of this generator, so we're bringing more polygons back onto the mesh. And when we do that, that adaptive sampling method I mentioned becomes much more apparent. And so if I zoom in here, what you're seeing on these edges, for example, in an effort to preserve the smoothness here, Cinema's actually realizing that we need to apply more polygons. Now, we can do this while still optimizing the mesh, in this case by 40%, because we're also finding these areas here that are much flatter, and we're pulling significantly in these areas. So this contrast that you're seeing in the polygon distribution is really what adaptive sampling is doing. Now, that said, I think we can get away with cranking this back up way higher. Let's go as high as 95. And so now this mesh is looking quite a bit lighter. I think this is something we can actually implement into a scene. Let's go ahead and bake this down as well. And if I turn off the wireframe now and we zoom in, unfortunately, a lot of that mesh distortion is back, and in fact, it's worse. But that is to be expected because we are only working with 5% of the original polygon count now, so this very much looks and feels like a low poly mesh. However, we can fix a lot of that just by bringing back another smoothing deformer. And this time, I'm going to keep it at 100% strength. And that's because I'm not so much worried about preserving any of those details that we have here as I am with just correcting any of the mesh distortion we were getting. OK, let's bake this down one last time. And now, let's bring back our high poly mesh, and I want to do a quick side-by-side comparison. I just want to show you guys really quickly. So if we turn on our wireframe, again, we're doing a great job of optimizing this compared to what it originally was. Remember, this is only 5% of the original polygon count. And yet, we are giving up quite a bit of detail. You can see just all of the small details, wrinkles, and everything happening here that's sort of being dissolved away in our processing. And that's not ideal. So what I want to show you guys next is a really cool technique we can use to actually transfer any of this missing data that you see here back onto our low poly mesh, but without altering the polygon count in any way. OK, let's take a step back. I'm going to hide our high poly asset again. Let's right-click on our low poly garbage bag, go into Cinema 4D tags, and apply a bake texture tag. Now, there are a bunch of settings here. We don't have to worry about all of them today, but we do need to set a directory. Let me navigate to my folder really quickly. I'm going to override this one here. I like to work in PNGs for this, and I want to make sure I'm working in 16-bit, and that's very important because I don't want to be compressing any of the height data that I'll be gathering today. Let's go ahead and increase our output size just a little bit. And we can ignore the rest of these settings for now. But if we jump into the Options tab, you can see there are a lot of different channels that we can actually be targeting here. I only want to worry about the normals channel for now. So let's enable this. You'll see a few more options pop up. Let's go ahead and drag in our high poly asset into the source field here. Remember, that's still in the scene. I just have it hidden in the viewport currently. Let's change our method to tangent. And now when I hit preview, you'll see Cinema's actually asking us for a texture tag. So let's just double click on our shelf down here. We'll apply a very standard material onto our low poly garbage bag. And now let's come back into our bake texture tag. We'll come down a little bit. And now when I hit preview, you'll see we're baking what appears to be a very sort of low resolution, black and white thumbnail. Now this is not a final representation of what we'll actually be baking, but this is a way for me to double check and confirm that there is information being captured. And since we know that there is, we can go ahead and bake this. You'll see it'll take a little bit longer, but we're baking what appears to be a proper normals map now. In fact, I actually pre-baked this out at a much higher resolution. Let's go ahead and load that in to this material that we already have applied to our mesh. I'm going to enable the normals channel here. Let's load this in. And here's this 4K version that I've pre-baked. And right away, you'll see an update in the viewport. Now, I do want to point out, it looks like there's some resolution issues happening. And we can actually fix most of this by going back into our material editor, and in the editor tab here, changing this texture preview size from default to no scaling. And what this is doing is just telling Cinema to not worry about down-resing the preview of this image in the viewport for performance reasons. Now, I do want to point out there's a little bit of those issues remaining, but that's actually just how it's previewed. So as soon as we render this, even just with standard renderer in the viewport, you can see now, look at all of these details that we're able to bring back onto this mesh. Let's come down here. And remember, very little of this is actually being driven from our geometry. Most of this is coming in from that normals map that we just baked and are applying to this mesh. In fact, let's bring back our high poly asset again. I'm going to create another material just so that the colors are consistent this time. Let's do another side-by-side comparison. And now when I render this, you can see here, look at how consistent we're able to achieve between both meshes. And yet, remember, the mesh on the right is only 5% of the original polygon count. And to be honest, we could probably go even further than this in terms of optimizing it. And so this is a very great, efficient, and effective way to be optimizing while still holding on to the mesh fidelity. OK, so from here, I do want to point out, unfortunately, as much as we've done on this mesh, it's probably still a little too heavy if we wanted to do something like add soft body dynamics. So what I can show you guys next is a really cool method to build a proxy version of this that we'll use to drive that simulation data. And to do this, I'm actually going to borrow a technique that was shared online by the wonderful Cinema 4D developer, Merk Filson. And I'm going to grab a sphere object. Let's increase the segments to 30. And I want to make this a child of our low-poly garbage bag, only so that I can hit Shift-C again to bring up the search bar. Let's search center to parent. And what this is doing is just copying over the positional values of our parent object. In this case, let's rename this the low-poly garbage bag onto our sphere object. Let's drag this out now. And I want to right-click on our sphere, go into Cinema 4D tags, and apply a display tag. Let's override the shading to lines. And now what you can see here is we actually have a nice representation of both of these assets simultaneously in the viewport. Let's apply a collision deformer to our sphere. And in the Colliders tab here, I want to change the solver from intersect to inside stretch. Let's go ahead and drag in this underlying garbage bag mesh into our objects field here. And now with the sphere selected and the scale tool enabled, what you'll see happen is actually really cool. As I start to scale down the sphere and these two meshes start to intersect, what you'll see happen is this collision deformer will actually start to kick in and start to absorb the shape of that underlying garbage bag mesh. And so this is a very cool and efficient way to be building, one step further of a proxy version of our asset. I do want to point out, if I zoom in here, it's not perfect. You can see it's not exactly the tightest fit on the mesh. And there are even areas of our garbage bag that are actually clipping outside of this cage. That's OK, though, because this cage isn't going to be visible in our render. This is simply a tool that we'll use to drive that simulation data. In fact, let's go ahead and add dynamics now. I'm going to bake this down really quickly. We'll rename this cage. And let's grab a plane. I'm going to lower this just a little bit. And we can actually hide our garbage bag for a little bit, because we're only going to be worrying about the cage asset for now. I'm going to delete the bake texture tag as well. All right, let's right-click on our plane, go into Simulation Tags, and I want to apply a collider body here. And on our cage asset, let's do the same thing, but I want to apply a soft body. And when I hit play, right away you'll see we're getting soft body dynamics in the viewport. Now, it does look like there's a little bit of a performance hit happening here. And we can fix this actually quite easily by going back into our soft body dynamics tag. Let's change a few things. I'm going to turn off self-collisions, as well as using the accuracy solver. Now, we're giving up a little bit of accuracy in the viewport here, but we are getting much better performance. I do want to point out, of course, we're not getting very realistic dynamics or physics happening. This isn't behaving the way we'd expect a garbage bag to sort of fall over. We can fix that very easily, though, by refining some of these settings in our soft body dynamics tag. The next thing I want to show you, though, first is actually if we bring back our low poly garbage bag. Here you can see currently there's no connection between these two assets. And remember, we want the cage to actually be driving what's happening to our low poly garbage bag. And in order to do this, there's actually just a few quick, simple steps. So let's jump back. I'm going to take our low poly garbage bag. Let's hit Alt-G to nest this inside of a null object. I'll rename this to garbage bag. And inside, I want to be putting in a mesh deformer. Let's make sure this is on the same hierarchical level as our garbage bag mesh. And in the cages field here, let's drag in the cage we've built and click Initialize. Now, when I hit play, you'll see it's quite broken. And that's because there's one last thing we need to address. So currently, what's happening here, if I zoom in, any of these areas of our underlying garbage bag mesh that are actually clipping outside of that cage we've built, currently these are sort of being left behind in this connection that we're building. And of course, that's not what we want. We want these areas included. And we can do this just by going back into our mesh deformer under the Advanced tab. And let's change external from ignore to surface. And now when I hit play, you can see here, the entire garbage bag mesh is sort of along for the ride. It's mimicking whatever's happening to that cage asset. And the really cool thing from here is now let's go ahead and refine our soft body dynamics settings. Now I want to remind you, these are actually being applied to our cage asset, not the actual garbage bag mesh. And yet, when I update these settings, you'll see they update in real time and are applied to our actual garbage bag mesh. And so the really cool thing now is we're getting real-time soft body dynamics in the viewport being applied to this mesh. We can actually go ahead and hide our cage asset, and so it's still being copied over here. And all of those high poly details that we had before are still being driven and applied through that normals map. And so one last time, if we bring back our high poly asset, you can see here, not only are we getting real-time soft body dynamics happening, but we've given up little to no difference in our mesh fidelity coming back to our source high poly mesh. Okay, moving on. I'm gonna grab a quick drink of water. Thank you. I also want to talk to you guys about scene management. And in order to do this, let's take a look at a much larger environment that I've recently worked on. This was a very exciting personal project called Kingston. And it was inspired from my morning and evening commutes while living in the city of Brooklyn. You can see here there are a lot of different props being loaded into the scene, everything from really large buildings and bodegas in the background down to the smallest individual foreground elements being scattered throughout. I'm using Octane Render in this case, and I'm actually tackling some pretty heavy rendering subjects such as volumetrics. Here's a look at the viewport inside of Cinema 4D, as well as a few props. Actually, that garbage bag that we just discussed is for this scene, and a few others. And a few quick facts about the scene. So there's a little over 2,000 viewport elements. And again, that's everything from buildings, bodegas, subway entrances, and various props being scattered, down to the smallest individual blades of grass, pebbles, leaves, and debris. There's only about 3 million polygons in all of that, though, and that's because I'm using a lot of those optimization techniques that we just discussed. There are almost 900 unique bitmap textures, though, and to be honest, that is a lot. And that's because I'm using a tool called Substance Painter. Now, for those of you who don't know, Substance Painter is essentially Photoshop for 3D models. In fact, Adobe actually just recently acquired Substance. And the advantage to using this tool is that I have a lot of manual control over how I'm texturing an asset. The disadvantage, though, is that you're looking at a lot of bitmaps in your output, specifically 1 bitmap per channel. You have multiple channels per material, and you could have multiple materials per asset. So this number's exponential, and actually quite quickly it can get out of control. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem is I actually have so much scene data in my scene that when I'm sending it over to render, I'm exceeding the VRAM capacity in my graphics cards. Now, for those of you who don't know, VRAM is essentially the storage component of your graphics cards, and if you're using a third-party render engine, in this case such as Octane, chances are a lot of the scene data is actually being sort of offloaded and processed here when you're rendering. And if you find yourself in a situation similar to mine here, where you're exceeding that capacity, you could be looking at a few different things. Most common is just general instability, which I'm sure most of us have experienced. But in more severe cases, you can be crashing, whether that's Cinema 4D or Octane in this case. So what can we do to fix this? Whether it's a client project or a personal one, at the end of the day, we still need to be able to set the render. So what I can show you guys is a really cool native tool inside of Cinema 4D that I used for this project to have better control over my VRAM allocation. And that tool is actually called XREFs. So XREFs have been around in Cinema for a while. And you have to think of them essentially as a container. And what it lets me do is dynamically import and reference a separate Cinema 4D file into the one I'm currently working on. And so hypothetically, you can imagine, say there are 2 artists maybe working on a project together. One is focusing on blocking out the master scene file, while another one is simultaneously iterating on a specific prop. You can be importing that prop file through an XREF into your master scene, and as it's iterated and updated, it'll be automatically updating in your master scene file. Now, in my case, I'm actually not working collaboratively, but I am using this as a tool to more strategically decide the level of fidelity and VRAM resources I'm pouring into each asset on a per-shot basis. Let me show you exactly what I mean by that. So if we click on our XREF, there are 2 fields here that we can look at. There's this reference field and a proxy reference field. In the reference field, I want to be loading in my high-resolution, hero-quality version of the asset. And the proxy reference, I want to be loading in a much more stripped-down, sort of minimal, conservative version of that asset. Let's go ahead and load in a high-resolution scene. And I want to point out, if I navigate to my folder really quickly, I'm doing something a little unique for this project. So in my hierarchy, I have this additional props folder. And inside, every asset that's being uniquely processed and loaded into the scene via an XREF is being given its own folder structure. And so let's use the sidewalk here as an example. Inside, you can see I have a 4K version of this scene saved out, as well as a proxy version. Let's go ahead and load in the 4K. And right away, you can see Cinema's processing in the scene. So we're loading in geometry. Octane's processing all of these materials down here in the shelf. While this is happening, let's bring up Octane's live viewer. I'll grab a drink really quickly. And if we set this over to render, you'll see we're looking at a really nice sidewalk asset. In fact, I can zoom in very close here, and the fidelity holds up really well. And that's because I'm using everything from 4K textures on the sidewalk, and I'm also scattering, look at all of these small little details, everything from various tiers of individual pebbles, individual blades of grass and leaves, and various trash. There are a lot of resources that I'm pouring into this asset, and because of that, it holds up really well up close. This is the level of fidelity I want to be loading in if I know I'm setting up a close-up maybe for an animation where this is going to be a main point of focus. I do want to point out, though, in Octane's live viewer, if I start clicking just with the left mouse click for a few times here, you can see there are these UI elements that are popping up. And these tell me a few different things, but I want to draw your attention to this last line here. It says used, free, and total VRAM. What this is telling me is that in this machine, I think I have it tucked away down here, I have 11 gigabytes of VRAM available. And in this scene file, this sidewalk asset alone, I'm currently utilizing a little over 1.2 gigabytes. That's leaving me with about 7 gigabytes to spare. Now, that math doesn't quite check out, just in case you're scratching your heads, but that's because Windows tends to reserve a little bit of that space for its own functions, so we're left with even less to use. But 7 gigabytes might sound like a lot, but you have to remember, this is one out of potentially 30 assets that I'm ultimately merging into one scene file. So quite quickly, I'm actually going to hit that capacity. And so what I want to show you guys is maybe we're setting up a different shot this time, and maybe this asset actually isn't going to be viewed up close. Maybe it's really, really far away from the camera, living in the background. Now, from this distance, we're not benefiting from all of those details. We're definitely not seeing the benefits of 4K textures, and we're definitely not seeing those individual pebbles that I'm scattering around. And yet, we're still utilizing 1.2 gigabytes of our VRAM, so we're still using the same amount of space for this asset. And this is where using a proxy version can be really handy. So if we come in here, let's load in the proxy version of this scene. And right away, nothing's actually happening, and that's because XREFs are essentially a switch, and we're still locked into that high-resolution version. And so if I click this Exchange with Proxy button, we'll swap over now. And what you'll see happen here, Cinema's swapping out the scene files, so it was pretty quick there, actually, but we've got new geometry in the scene, and now we have significantly less materials. We only have one material now, and that's because I'm getting rid of any of those unnecessary assets for this. So, of course, we've gotten rid of all of the scattering, and the elephant in the room is that this is very, very muddy textures. The resolution here does not hold up well, and that's because I'm taking those 4K textures into Photoshop, and I'm down-resing them down to like 325 pixels. So they're very, very small, and because of that, it doesn't hold up well up close. But this isn't meant to be viewed up close. This is meant to be viewed quite far away. Maybe there's some depth of field to help us out. And now if we come back here and we bring up these UI elements again, you can see now we're down to 700 megabytes. So we've almost cut our usage in half for this asset by swapping out into the proxy version. Let me give you a more practical example of really how I'm using this in the master file. And so here you can see if I jump out of my camera, again, there are a lot of different assets that I'm loading into the scene, especially off in the distance. All of these different buildings and vehicles in the streets and sidewalks. But let's say, again, maybe we're setting up a close-up. We really want to be emphasizing the fidelity of our sidewalk asset here as well as the subway entrance. Now, we're not seeing all of those background assets, so can we be deleting them from the scene to save on that space? With some of them we probably can, like the vehicles, that might be okay. But what about this bodega here? I've got this building. What if we were to hide this? Maybe it's just in the corner, some depth of field. We really don't see much of it. Well, if I come in and I do this, what if that bodega had a light source, and now we're actually missing the emissive properties of that in our scene? What if there were puddles on the sidewalk, and now we're missing the reflections of that bodega in the surface? But even more subtle than that, maybe there's just lighting in the scene that's indirectly bouncing off the surface of that bodega. By removing things entirely from our viewport, we risk running into inconsistencies in our render. And that's ultimately where I'm using XREFs in this project. So rather than turning it off entirely, instead I can be coming in, swapping it out for the proxy version, and again, that's muddy textures, less geometry, but we are getting an accurate enough stand-in to still be getting consistent results with our light interaction, with our reflections, and that's ultimately how I'm using XREFs in the scene, just as a strategic tool to decide when and where I'm pouring my resources. So if I know I'm setting up a close-up shot here in the foreground, we can down-res a lot of these background assets, much like you would with an LOD workflow, in turn freeing up enough space that, you know what, maybe we can actually afford to put 8K textures in our sidewalk asset now. Okay, moving on. I also want to talk to you guys through a case study from a recent project called Harvest. This was a very exciting personal project that I worked on for about a month in my spare time at the end of last year. And you can see here, I'm pouring in a lot of details into this piece, everything down to individual dust particles. And with that came a lot of really interesting and unique obstacles. And so what I'd love to do is just walk you guys through some of the different phases of development that this project took today. And if there's time, I'll also demo a little bit of the specific photogrammetry pipeline I developed to create some of these gourd assets just by 3D scanning them with my iPhone. Okay, so getting started with inspiration, there were two main directions I was looking at, and that is food photography, which I'm looking at for compositional reference. The center image here was a main source of inspiration for the piece, both compositionally as well as the lighting. And I'm also being drawn to the variety of textures and colors found in various seasonal fruit. But I'm also, more interestingly, being drawn to classical art. And so I'm looking at Flemish painting more specifically for a few of its defining characteristics. And that's everything from the more muted color palettes that you can find in a lot of these pieces, as well as the general haziness, and as well as just compositional consistencies that are found throughout the body of work. And from here, I'm entering into more of an exploratory or discovery phase. And what I mean by that is really setting aside time inside of Cinema 4D to just try out whatever was interesting to me at the time. And at the time of working on this, that was actually photogrammetry. Now, I didn't have any experience in that, but I did have a pipeline in mind, and I was able to find some 3D scans of pumpkins online. And so by using Substance Painter, I was actually able to conduct some of these earliest fidelity tests. And so on the right is this sort of first approach at building a more procedural, layered approach to texturing an asset. So I'm starting with a very clean, organic shader for the pumpkin, and then I'm layering in various amounts of damage, height information, details, dust, whatever it may be. And on the left is this sort of ensemble of about a week's worth of these fidelity tests. Now from here, I'm getting a better idea of wanting to tackle a still life, and so I'm thinking about the different props that I want to be including. And actually, sketching these out does help push the visual direction of the piece. And from here, this may sound a little counterintuitive, but I'm actually putting all of that prop development on pause so I can instead shift over and focus on developing a staging environment. And what I mean by that is building a separate Cinema 4D file where I'm purely focused on achieving the mood that I had in mind, as well as really finessing and troubleshooting the lighting setup, because I knew I wanted that to play a main compositional element in this piece. By separating that from everything else, I can really do just that. And the added benefit to doing it in this order is that I now have an excellent staging environment that I can be dropping in props as I'm building them, such as these fidelity tests, to be checking everything from the texture resolution that I'm applying here, as well as color consistency with the palettes that I'm selecting. This is an excellent tool to be using constantly and referencing throughout the remaining part of the project. And now from here, I'm entering my favorite part of the project, which is prop development. And so I'm dedicating a solid 2 weeks of development just to building out this massive library of assets. And one of the things I like to point out here is when you work on large or longer form personal work, one of the things you encounter is just maintaining a sense of motivation and momentum, especially after you've crossed that halfway mark. And what I love to do at this particular phase is find these little opportunities to break assets out and treat them almost like their own little mini projects. There's a little bit more of an immediate satisfaction to that, which can be energetic and help you get excited about the project again. And so I'm doing that with all of these. I'm spending 2 or 3 days making sure that this is the best gourd it can possibly be. And I'm extending that across the entire library that you see here. But then comes the scary part, which is we know all of these pieces work well on their own, but more importantly, we know that they need to come together and form one cohesive piece. Now, of course, you should be doing some level of pre-planning, whether that's at least sketching it out or at least thinking about how things come together. But inevitably, that rarely comes together exactly as you planned, and you will find yourself in this awkward phase where you're frustrated and you're just pushing things around in the viewport. And so what I can show you really quickly, because this was actually the largest obstacle I faced in this piece, with it being a still life where composition is really everything, I can show you a really cool and overlooked tool that's very easy to rely on at these sort of moments of frustration. And that is if we jump into the camera tab, in this composition tab, you can see there are a lot of different settings here, which you should definitely spend time familiarizing yourself with. But I'm just going to enable golden sections as well as golden spiral. Now, there's definitely not enough time to jump too deep into art theory today. but I did record, but I will kind of discuss a little bit of what's happening here. So this is essentially a strong foundation that you can rely on for the directional flow that viewers' eyes will take when they're addressing and looking at this piece. And so it's actually just being stamped into the camera here. I can actually turn it off and you see it's just being applied to the camera. And what I can do is reinforce this direction at every opportunity in the piece. Everything from the way that the lighting is sort of being positioned out of frame, helping to push your eyes inward. Again here with the positioning and rotation of the glasses and the book. And again, getting picked up over here with the corn. Everything is positioned in a way to help guide your eyes through this piece. And because of that, it feels much more natural. And that's really all I wanted to show you very quickly with this tool. It's just a very easy tool to rely on at moments of frustration. Okay, now the big question. From here, of course I'm rendering, I'm still iterating everything from the textures, the props, the lighting setup, but the number one question I get asked with this piece is how I achieved that painterly look. And I wish there was this hidden button inside of Octane I could tell you guys about, but really it's a lot more subtle than that. It's just a series of decisions that I'm making that, when ultimately stacked together, ultimately end up in that final look. In fact, if we take a step back, this is one of those inspiration pieces that I pulled up during my research. It's a Flemish painting. And again, I want to point out, there's a few characteristics here we can take notice of. So there's this very muted color palette. There's not a lot of saturation or vibrancy being found in this piece. There's also this sort of haziness to it, and that's washing out our black values. So there's not a lot of strong black values, but it's also sort of coating over the entire piece, helping to make it feel a little bit more cohesive. And if you think about it, all of these attributes can be recreated in a 3D viewport. In fact, if we take a step back, so this is actually the raw image being exported out of Octane without any post-grading, without volumetrics being rendered, and without a details pass where I'm adding everything from dust and cobwebs. You can see here, it looks nice, but it is a little clean, it's kind of waxy, and there's definitely a lot of saturation being found, especially in the subsurface scattering of some of these more organic shapes. However, just by introducing this details pass, where I'm introducing dust with Octane scatter as well as Cinema 4D hair for some of the fuzzier areas, as well as cobwebs just with image textures actually, you can see I'm actually able to pull out a lot of the subsurface scattering. And let's take a step back just so you can really see what's happening here. It's kind of subtle, but by introducing these elements, we're one step closer to getting that sort of antique look. And then from here, now I'm introducing volumetrics into the scene. And of course, rendering volumetrics in an interior environment with Octane does add quite a bit of render time, but it is doing a few very important things for me. It's washing out those black values, which you can see definitely like down here in an area like this, if we jump back. But it's also, again, coating over the whole piece, helping my color palette feel a little bit more cohesive. And then from here, I'm reinforcing all of these ideas in my post-grading process. And so I'm taking this into Photoshop, I'm brushing in additional softness in some areas, some sharpening in other areas, as well as a temperature shift, and manually going in and really boosting some of that volumetric feeling. And so just by cycling through this sequence one more time, you can see, just by making a series of very purposeful decisions, we're actually able to achieve that final look. Okay, moving on, I also want to demo for you guys a little bit of the specific photogrammetry pipeline that I developed to create some of these gourds just by 3D scanning them with my iPhone. Now, I do have a few quick caveats with this. As this was a personal project, I had little to no experience with photogrammetry or photography for that matter, as well as little to no budget. And so what I want to show you guys today is the approach that I took, which was very much in the mindset of trying to be as accessible as possible, as well as very much in the mindset of a beginner. And so we're going to make some mistakes together, basically is what I'm saying. Here is the pipeline that I developed. Now, this looks a little complicated, but I promise you it's not. I'm actually just using my iPhone to take a series of about 90 to 100 images of my subject. So if you say this is a gourd here, I'm just trying to capture every conceivable angle that I can in a 360 degree around that asset. And then what I can do from there is actually feed that image sequence from my iPhone into a really cool free image processing tool called Mushroom. And what this will do, I'll show you a little bit of this, but what it'll do is actually complete a series of tasks against that to reconstruct a point cloud. And then from there, we can mesh that. We'll take it into Cinema 4D to take advantage of some of R20's new features today to actually clean up our scan, as well as rely on a few third-party tools to actually retopo the mesh as well as my texturing process. And the other thing I want to point out as well is that Mushroom does this really cool thing where it'll actually export out a diffuse map that we can use as a really strong foundation for texturing our asset. And with a little bit of post-processing here, we can actually feed this into our texturing process in the end to have a really strong foundation. Okay, so this is actually the image sequence I'm feeding into Mushroom. So I'm making a lot of mistakes here, guys. I'm taking this with my iPhone. It's in the kitchen table of the office I was working at the time. Very inconsistent lighting. I've got this propped up on like a wire spool. There's sharp highlights, even stronger shadows. I'm making just about every mistake you can possibly make here. And that's important to note because even with these mistakes, I'm still able to achieve a very high level of fidelity. In fact, here you can see, so it's a time-intensive process. I did have to record a little bit of the footage, but this is actually feeding it into Mushroom without changing any of the import settings. And what you can see over time, what happens is Mushroom will actually reassign positional values for each of those images we give it. And so here you can see, you can imagine this is sort of the route that I took when I was taking photos of this image. So I did 3 tiers, sort of under, middle, and then above. And by feeding this in, we're actually able to recreate this sort of 3D point cloud representation of our asset. Remember, all of this is being driven from our iPhone images. And we can actually mesh this inside of Mushroom. And so here you can see is the actual 3D scan that we're able to retrieve. I can zoom in here and I'll turn off the texture. And you can see just the mesh fidelity alone is actually quite impressive. This is definitely something we can use in our pipeline. Let's go ahead and load this into Cinema. Oh, looks like it didn't open. Here we go. Here we go. OK, I do want to point out there are some discrepancies between what we see here and what we just saw in Mushroom, but we can fix this very easily by taking advantage of some of R20's new features. First, let's get rid of all of these unnecessary polygons that our scan captured here at the bottom. And to do this, let's just we'll go into our polygon mode. Let's grab the rectangle selection tool. I want to make sure only select visible elements is turned off. Let's jump into a side view. I want to zoom out a little bit. And we'll just group select all of these unnecessary polygons. Just jump back into our perspective view, and we can just go ahead and delete these. And now you'll see already, we're cleaning up our asset quite a bit, but I do want to show you now how we can clean up the surface of our scan, as well as patch this hole that we've just now created by deleting all of those polygons. And to do this, we're going to take advantage of some of R20's new features. So let's bring in a volume builder. I'm going to drag in our gourd. And what you'll see happen here, Cinema 4D actually converts that polygon mesh that we fed it into a VDB object. So this is almost like a volumetric representation of our gourd. And from here, we can actually go ahead, let's decrease the voxel size. So we'll actually crank up the resolution a little bit. We'll lower this down to something like 0.5 centimeters. And so now you can see we're getting a much closer representation of our gourd. Let's bring in a volume mesher now. And I'm going to increase the voxel range threshold just a little bit. We'll kind of eye this until we get something we like. OK, that looks pretty good. So now the surface is looking quite a bit better. But there is still this hole at the bottom. But I want to show you guys a really cool technique that we can use now. So let's just grab a sphere. I'm going to scale this down a little bit. Now, I would encourage you guys, if this was actually for the real project, spend a little bit of extra time sculpting this, making it feel as cohesive as you possibly can. But for the sake of keeping things quick here, I'm just going to cap this hole off. And I want to point out, of course, this looks like 2 different objects because they very much are. But if we feed this sphere into our volume tree that we've built, what you'll see happen here is this sphere shape is actually being added in and calculated into our shape before that VDB conversion. And so this is actually a really cool way, after we mesh this, to create a single uniform mesh in the end. And this is a great way to be patching any holes or errors that you might be getting in your scanning, as well as maybe potentially merging 2 separate scans if you're maybe scanning the bottom of an asset first and then doing a top element separately. You can be merging them together using this process. Now, I do want to point out, unfortunately, the topology here is less than ideal, especially the lack of proper edge flow. That's going to be quite a headache if we want to do something like UV unwrap this asset. And so what we can do from here, I'm actually relying on a few third-party tools, which I'll show you some footage of really quickly. So I'm actually taking this mesh that you just saw into a really cool tool called 3D Coat. And I'm using this because it has an excellent auto retopology algorithm. You could also use a tool like ZBrush for this. And with just changing a few quick settings, what I'm able to do, I'm going to speed up this footage a little bit, but I can actually import my mesh and quite quickly and automatically actually retopologize this mesh into something that has much better edge flow. Now you'll see here, it's not perfect, but it is something that we can definitely work with, especially when it comes to UV unwrapping. And in fact, from here, while we're in 3D Coat, I actually went ahead and UV unwrapped this here. Now, UV unwrapping is quite an iterative process, which makes it kind of difficult to demo live. But there are a few considerations I have in mind while I'm doing this. And this is everything from where I'm placing my seams, because that'll likely be visible in my textures that I'm outputting, as well as trying to maintain some level of balance in my textile density, because that'll be really important for resolution issues. Now, I do want to point out, I'm doing this in 3D Coat, but of course, Cinema 4D has a wonderful pipeline for this. So I'm going to demo a little bit of that here for you guys very quickly. So if we just create a new scene, I'll just do it on a very primitive object. So let's use a cylinder. I'll decrease the rotation segments down to like 10. Let's make this editable. I want to make sure I'm optimizing this. Let's grab our edges. I want to hit UL to do a loop selection. We're going to grab both caps of our asset here. And I want to grab just one connecting edge between the two. And let's actually remove one from each cap. And this is because I want to be unwrapping a single uniform island. So I want these all to be connected in the end. From here, let's hit Shift-C to bring up the search bar. I'm going to type in Set Selection. And what we're doing here is we're actually saving these edges that we've selected onto the selection tag. And from here, I'm going to rename this to UV just so we can keep track of it. Let's jump into our Body Paint UV edit mode. And I want to quickly do a frontal projection. And now if we jump into the Relax UV mode, I want to make sure Pin Border Points is turned off. And I want to make sure all of these other settings here, Cut Selected Edges, Use Tag, and Auto Realign are all turned on. And now we can go ahead and drag in that selection tag that we saved here and renamed UV and click Apply. And now you can see we're actually using these edges that we had selected as our guides for where we're placing our cuts. And from here, of course, you can be selecting this, you can be repositioning it, rotating, as well as scaling. Just a very quick overview of how UV unwrapping works inside of Cinema. And then from here, I'm actually feeding this gourd asset into a really cool tool that I mentioned called Substance Painter. And so I actually have sort of a hybrid approach here where I'm layering in procedural materials that I'm building. So I'm building my own height information, as well as like subsurface scattering properties, but then I'm also layering in that diffuse map that Meshroom outputs that I mentioned before. And so here you can see is this sort of stacked hybrid approach where I'm layering in just very amounts of detail to get that final look. And the end result is actually quite impressive. In fact, I can feed this now into another staging environment that I've got set up inside of Cinema. Let's go ahead and render this. I'm using Octane, of course. And here you can see is the final result we're able to get. And remember, all through that processing, we're left with a mesh that has excellent topology, it's been properly UV unwrapped, and all of this stems from those original iPhone photos that we took. And so this is ultimately the mesh that I'm feeding into my master scene file. Okay, lastly, I want to leave you guys with a few quick takeaways. It's like my favorite movie. And that is, the best tool is one that plays well with others. You know, it's no secret, I spend a lot of time jumping back and forth between various third-party tools. And if there's one thing I've learned in that, it's often I get into that tool, I get what I need out of it, but then I'm quickly out of it and I'm back into Cinema. And that's been that way for a while. And I think that's because Cinema 4D makes for an excellent hub. It's flexible, yet it has enough structure to support various pipelines and workflows. You guys saw with the Marvelous Designer stuff, it looked great, but it was really heavy. And by using some of Cinema 4D's native tools, we could actually optimize that into a much, much lighter state. Also, when pushing for fidelity, it's really important to consider performance. Not every asset needs to have 8K or even 4K textures being loaded, especially if it's living in the background. And I think the sooner you can learn to adopt some of these optimization habits, you can weave that more naturally into your workflow, and so you can avoid these sort of last-minute optimization passes just to get it to render in the 11th hour. And lastly, I want to encourage you guys to find your ceiling, whatever that may be, and break it. I love trying out new tools, and if there's one thing I've learned from that, it's having even a surface-level understanding of what else is out there is going to give you intuition. And really what that means is you'll just have a head start when it comes time to problem solve an issue you might not have experienced before. Okay, thank you guys so much. I really hope you enjoyed this. Special thanks to Maxon for having me today. You guys can find me on all social media channels at aaroncovrett.com, and my email is hello@aaroncovrett.com. Thank you.